Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something essential for any organization trying to keep up. Change management. We've got a great set of source materials here, actually sent in by one of you listening, which is fantastic. So, our mission for this deep dive, use these texts as our guide. Figure out what change management really is, why it's so vital, what makes it tricky, the risks, and how companies actually navigate it all successfully, according to this material anyway.
Yeah, and it's so relevant today. It's fundamentally about, well, how organizations stay agile, how they build resilience. Things are always changing, tech, markets, you name it. Being able to make necessary changes without grinding everything to a halt, that's absolutely crucial. It lets you stay focused on your goals even when things are in flux.
Exactly. So we'll be digging into definitions, a pretty detailed step-by-step process from the source, the different environments where changes happen, the risks involved, and also the safeguards or controls companies use. Plus, methodologies, things like patch management, system conversions, and crucially, testing, all straight from these texts. Okay, let's dive right in then. What exactly is change management according to these sources? Let's start there.
Right. The sources define it as essentially the whole package of policies, procedures, and resources an organization uses to govern change, any kind of change. And what's important here is that the source material points out these changes aren't always, internal strategic decisions, like choosing a new system. They can be external forces too. Think new regulations or a key supplier suddenly going out of business, or, well, big market shifts forcing you to adapt your processes.
And no matter where the change starts, inside or out, the impact usually ripples through the IT infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Hardware, software, even the rules around how IT operates, the governance stuff.
Precisely. And the sources make a point about the scope here. It's not just for those massive once-in-a-decade overhauls like replacing a whole core system. It applies just as much to routine things, rolling out a new software patch, installing standard updates for everyone, that kind of thing.
Hold on. So the same basic approach applies to replacing a multi-million-dollar system and just pushing out a security patch. That seems extensive.
According to these texts, yes. The thinking is the same, because any change, big or small, introduces some level of risk, and the whole point of change management fundamentally is to manage and mitigate those risks, to keep the day-to-day business running smoothly, minimizing disruption while you make necessary adjustments. That's the constant thread.
Ah, okay. So it's less about managing the change itself and more about managing the risk that comes with the change, keeping the lights on while you tinker behind the scenes.
Exactly. You want to evolve, but you don't want to break things in the process. So, if that's the what and the why, how do organizations actually do it? The sources lay out a pretty detailed process, don't they? They really do. The text calls it a robust change management process and frames it as essential. The goal is basically to let the organization adapt new apps, new hardware, staying current without losing the ability to operate or, losing sight of its main goals. It's a roadmap. And it's an 11-step process they outline. Let's walk through it. It's quite the blueprint. First, identify and define the need for the change. Sounds basic, but it forces you to get really clear. What's the problem? What's the opportunity? Why this change?
Okay, nailing down the why first. Makes sense.
Second, design a high-level plan. This
Yeah.
is sketching out the destination. What are the goals? What does success actually look like? Third, obtain approval from management. Super important. It's not just a rubber stamp. It gives authority and shows it's a priority.
Right, you need that backing.
Fourth, develop an appropriate budget and timeline. Change isn't free. It needs money. It needs people's time. So you allocate resources and set realistic deadlines here. 5, assign personnel responsible. Who owns this? Who's doing the work? Clear accountability. 6, and this is key, identify and address potential risks proactively. What could go wrong? How bad could it be? And what can we do now to prevent it or lessen the impact? We'll definitely circle back to risk later. The sources spend a lot of time on it.
Good, because that seems crucial.
7, provide an implementation roadmap. This turns the high-level plan into the actual step-by-step how-to, the detailed action plan. 8, procure necessary resources and train the appropriate personnel. Get the tools, the licenses, whatever you need, and make sure the team knows how to use the new system or follow the new process. Get everyone ready.
So making sure you have the what and who prepared.
Exactly. 9, test the system change. Absolutely critical before you go live. Does it work? Does it break anything else? Validate, validate, validate. 10, execute the implementation plan. Go time. Make the change happen according to the roadmap. And finally, 11, review and monitor change implementation and test as needed. It's not over just because it's live. You need ongoing checks to make sure it's working effectively and stays stable.
Wow, okay, 11 steps. It feels very deliberate, very structured. Why is that structure so important, according to these sources?
Well, that structure is really the core of it, based on this material. It's designed to bring order to potential chaos. By following these steps in sequence, it forces the organization to think everything through. You can't just jump to implementation without considering risks or testing properly, which, let's be honest, is often where things fall apart.
Right, it forces you to look before you leap, to anticipate the problems.
Precisely. It's about proactive problem solving. You identify issues early, plan for them, get approvals, make sure you have the resources, and verify it all works before it impacts the live business.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've got the definition and the how, that 11-step process. The sources also talk about where these changes happen, right? These separate environments.
Yes, absolutely. That's a fundamental concept, especially in IT. The idea is simple. You do the messy work, the building and testing, in places that are completely separate from the live system everyone relies on day to day.
Like not working on the plane's engine while it's mid-flight.
Exactly that analogy. You need safe spaces. The sources list a few key ones. First is the development environment. This is the workshop where programmers write the code, build prototypes, tinker. It's got all the coding tools, debuggers, that sort of thing. Then there's the testing environment. Code moves here for debugging and functional testing. The source notes it can sometimes be the same as development, but often it's kept separate.
Why?
Well, a separate testing environment gives you a dedicated space just for really scrutinizing nearly finished code, away from the ongoing churn of new development, more focused debugging. Next up is staging. This one's critical. The source calls it production-like. The goal is to make it mimic the live production environment as closely as possible. Same hardware specs, software versions, network setup, maybe even anonymized real data.
To the dress rehearsal.
Exactly. It's where you test everything together, functionality, how it plays with other systems, security, performance under load, before it faces actual users. Then you have production. That's the live stage. The system users interact with daily to do their jobs or access services. That's the real deal. And finally, the source mentions the disaster recovery environment. Now, this isn't for putting in new changes, but it's vital for change management because it's your fallback. It's where you go to recover systems and data if a change in production goes horribly wrong, causes an outage. Your safety net.
Okay, so development is the workshop, testing is the focused test bench, staging is the full-on simulator or test track, production is the open road, and disaster recovery is the emergency tow truck and repair shop standing by.
Perfect summary. And using these separate environments is all about, you guessed it, mitigating risk. You find the problems in development, testing, or staging, not when it can hurt real users and the business in production.
Which brings us neatly to risk. This is where it gets really interesting, I think. What potential dangers do the sources highlight when organizations try to manage change? It's clearly not simple.
No, definitely not. And the sources stress that identifying risks isn't a one-off step. It's woven throughout the process. And these aren't just tech glitches. They cover everything from decisions to people. The texts actually break risks down by stage, which is helpful. First up are selection and acquisition risks. These happen when you're choosing and buying new IT stuff. A big one is lack of expertise. The people doing the buying might not fully grasp the technical details or how the new thing fits into the bigger picture. They might buy something incompatible or just not right.
Yeah, I can see that happening easily.
Another is the lack of a formal selection and acquisition process. If it's all a bit chaotic, you risk overspending, making dodgy deals. The source even mentions kickbacks as a possibility, highlighting control failures, or just buying tech that doesn't align with your strategy. It's about disorganized or ill-informed buying. And then there's software-hardware vulnerability and incompatibility. The new thing might have security holes or maybe just won't work properly with your existing systems. That's a classic problem. The sources link these risks to an AI CPA standard, CC 5.1, basically saying you need to think about controls and safeguards early, even before you buy.
Makes total sense. Buying the wrong thing up front just sets you up for failure later.
It really does. Then, moving on, the source talks about integration risks. This is when you're trying to weave the new thing into your current operations. And this phase, often the most difficult, according to the text, it involves tech and people. A huge one is user resistance. People often don't like changing how they work. They might ignore training, stick to old habits, or find workarounds. It's a human factor you can't ignore.
Oh yeah, the we've always done it this way problem.
Exactly. And related to that is lack of management support. If the bosses aren't visibly backing the change, providing resources, addressing concerns, it just fuels that resistance. The source also flags a lack of stakeholder support, maybe suppliers or even customers push back if they're affected. Then there are resource concerns. Change takes time and money. If you don't budget enough or overload your staff, the implementation can just fizzle out or fail. A very real risk is business disruption. A bad IT change can absolutely cause system failures, outages, lost revenue, direct impact. And finally, the technical headache of lack of system integration, especially with older legacy systems. Trying to connect old tech with new tech can be incredibly complex and messy.
That list really emphasizes the people side of things. Resistance, support, it's not just about code. How do the sources suggest tackling something like user resistance? Seems tricky.
While the text doesn't give a specific HR guide, but the process it outlines helps manage it. Clear communication, proper training, getting that management buy-in, having review boards to address issues, these are all built into those 11 steps and the controls we'll discuss. It's about involving people and structuring the change, not just dropping tech on them. The last risk category mentioned is outsourcing risks. This is when you hire another company to handle some or all of the change. A key risk is the third party's lack of organizational knowledge. They might not really get your specific business needs, leading to solutions that miss the mark. There's also uncertainty of the third party's knowledge and management. Are their staff actually qualified? Is their management effective? You're placing trust, and there's a risk they might not deliver. And a big one, lack of security. Sharing sensitive data with an outside firm always carries risk. Do they have strong enough security? If not, you could face a breach originating from them.
So outsourcing might look cheaper or bring in skills, but wow, it opens up a whole new set of risks you need to actively manage. You're basically trusting them with your data security too.
You absolutely are. Which leads us right into the next topic. How do you build the safeguards? The change management controls. Right, so once you've identified these risks, and remember, the sources say do this early, and often you design and implement controls. Think of them as safety checks, procedures, guardrails. Their job is to minimize the chance that those risks will actually blow up and cause problems.
Okay, these are the things that keep the change process from going off the rails.
Pretty much. The sources list quite a few important ones, policies and procedures. The actual documented rules for everything, from requesting a change to maintaining it. The rulebook, emergency change policies, special, faster processes for crises like urgent security patches. But crucially, the source says even these need audit trails and controls. Speed, yes, but controlled speed. Standardized change requests. Using the same forms and process for every request ensures you get all the needed info consistently. Impact assessment. Formally figuring out how a change might affect the business before you do it helps you prepare. Authorization. Getting the right sign-offs, especially for big changes, prevents rogue actions. Separation of duties. This is classic. Don't let the same person do everything. The source gives a great example. The person who writes the code shouldn't be the same person who puts it into production. Needs an independent check.
Prevent someone slipping in bad or untested code.
Exactly. Protects against errors and potentially malicious acts. Conversion controls. Specific checks when moving data between old and new systems to prevent errors. Reversion access. Having a plan and the ability to roll back to the old system if the new one causes big problems. The source mentions parallel implementation, running both old and new side by side for a while as one way to make rollback easier. Pre-implementation testing. Testing before you go live. We talked about this. Post-implementation testing. Testing after you go live to confirm it worked and is stable. Ongoing monitoring. Keep checking things periodically, even after the change is done. Weekly at first, maybe less often later, catches long-term issues.
That's a really comprehensive list. Covers planning, approvals, security, testing, recovery.
A layered defense. It is, and the source ties this back to things like SOC2 audits. Auditors look for these controls as proof an organization manages change responsibly, meeting criteria like CC 8.1. And to show controls are adequate, organizations need regular risk assessments considering factors like the economy, regulations, competition, new business lines, tech changes, vendor partnerships. It's all connected.
So controls aren't just technical steps in isolation. They're part of the whole business risk picture.
Precisely. And a big part of making controls work is keeping good records. Which brings us to documentation.
Yeah, the sources frame documentation as a control itself. It's not just paperwork. Why? Because it creates that reliable history, that log of what changed, when, why, and by whom.
The system's history book, like you said. Right. And good documentation helps with tracking and management, keeping everything organized, efficient, compliant, troubleshooting. If something breaks, the docs tell you what might have caused it. Invaluable. Staff training helps people understand how things work and why, improving performance. Looking back at past changes helps you learn and get better. Two specific types of documentation get highlighted. First, baseline configuration. Basically, it's a documented snapshot of your system before you make changes. A starting point. Why? It ensures changes are consistent. It's a benchmark to compare against after the change did performance improve or worsen, helps find root causes of problems, and helps evaluate if the change was even effective. How? The sources mention checklists with timestamps for a step-by-step record, or baseline images, graphical maps of the system which make comparing before and after visually clear. You can also track baseline metrics like system uptime, resource utilization, failover time. If those metrics get worse after a change compared to the baseline, that's a red flag. The second type is a system component inventory, just what it sounds like. A list of everything hardware, software, devices, assets, just what it sounds like, includes details like purpose, location, status, specs, model serial numbers. Just what it sounds like. Why? Essential for tracking assets nearing end of life, repairs, ownership, upgrade needs, troubleshooting, basically knowing what you have.
These feel so fundamental. You can't manage change if you don't know what you started with or what components are even involved. It's like trying to navigate without a map or inventory list.
Exactly. You're flying blind otherwise. And having these controls and documentation is great, but how do you know they're actually working? You test.
Perfect segue.
But
How do the sources say we verify all this? Let's get into the testing details.
right, the sources are clear. Testing should be ongoing for every system undergoing change. The goal: make sure new stuff doesn't break existing functionality or open up security holes. And testing needs review, plus that rollback plan if things go south. The basic purpose of testing, according to the text, is threefold. See if the software works as intended, find errors, bugs, missing pieces, confirm it meets what the business and users actually need. And there's a general software testing process. 1, plan it out. Roles. Timeline. 1, plan it out. 2, prioritize key areas to test. 1, plan it out. 3, decide what kind of tests and what you want to learn. 1, plan it out. 4, do the tests. 1, plan it out. 5, log results, track defects. 1, plan it out. 6, report findings, fix the bugs. Pretty standard stuff. But beyond just testing the code, the sources emphasize change review. They strongly recommend a formal change advisory board, CAB. Think of it as the change control tower, the CAB's job. Approve changes, ensure documentation is good, tell users what's happening, allocate resources for testing and response. A key control the CAB enforces: separate environments and strict access control. Again, the source is explicit. Developers don't get production access, and production operators don't get development access. Reinforces that crucial separation. Other tools mentioned to help review: automatic notifications on code changes, and code repository tools for managing code review and implementation.
A CA. That makes a lot of sense. A dedicated group focused solely on overseeing change, making sure the process is followed.
It's a vital governance layer, and the source provides a really stark example of what happens without it. The Lasso Co. story. Lasso Co. made healthcare billing software. Big company. They had a development environment, but here's the catch. It contained a replica of actual customer data for troubleshooting. They had a development environment, but here's the catch. A new developer working in this environment temporarily switched off a control designed to stop test claims from being sent to real insurance companies. They had a development environment, but here's the catch. They had a development environment, but here's the catch. Real claims already sent by the client got resubmitted accidentally by the developer from the test environment. They had a development environment, but here's the catch. The result: double payments, massive headaches for the client, untangling it all, and it triggered insurance company audits. They had a development environment, but here's the catch, and the kicker. Lasso Co. didn't catch it. The client found it much later.
Wow, just wow, that's a nightmare scenario. One small control change combined with replicated live data in a test environment caused huge financial and reputational problems. And it wasn't even malicious.
Exactly. It perfectly illustrates the risk when controls, especially separation of duties and environment isolation, aren't strictly enforced. The source analysis. A proper CAB likely would have prevented it through better controls. Or, at minimum, disabling that control would have triggered immediate alerts, allowing for a much faster fix before it became an audit nightmare. And when things do go wrong, like with Lasso Co., you need that rollback capability. Purpose: undo the bad change quickly. Process: tell users before you roll back. And you need that accurate system configuration inventory to know what state to return to. Even after rollback, you need post-implementation review. Did the rollback work correctly? Test again.
The undo button, but with a process and verification around it.
Precisely. And finally, the sources list specific types of testing performed. Unit testing, smallest level. Developers test their own individual pieces of code. Integration testing. Testing how different units or modules work together. Helps plan future maintenance, too. System testing. Testing the whole system working together. Overall functionality performance. Often done by QA. Acceptance testing. Does it meet user needs? Includes beta testing with real customers or end user testing with employees.
So testing happens at every level, from the tiniest code snippet right up to whether the final thing actually works for the people using it. Okay, we have definitely covered a lot of ground on change management today. Drawing straight from the source material you shared, we defined it, walked through that detailed 11-step process. It explored those crucial separate environments, dev, test, staging, production, DR, and why that isolation matters. We looked squarely at the risks, from selection errors to user resistance and outsourcing pitfalls.
Then we dug into the controls, policies, approvals, separation of duties, rollback plans, testing, monitoring, and how documentation like baselines and inventories forms a critical foundation.
We spent a good chunk of time on testing acceptance criteria, logging. The John Doe example really brought that to life, evaluating results, and even touched on CI/CD and that speed versus control dynamic.
We contrasted waterfall and agile methodologies, using the refraction realty story to illustrate agile, covered patch management specifics, different ways to convert whole systems.
And drove home the importance of review with the CAB concept and that cautionary lasso coat tale about what happens when controls fail. Finishing with the different levels of testing from unit to acceptance.
Yeah, I think the main takeaway from digging into this material is pretty clear. Effective change management isn't just, installing an update. It's a whole interconnected system. Policies, processes, technical controls, monitoring, documentation, human oversight, all working together. And the ultimate goal, to let the organization change and adapt, which it has to do, but without causing chaos or major disruptions along the way, keeping things stable while evolving.
So for you listening, think about changes you see around you, a new tool at work, a different team process, maybe even a big personal project. Do you see some of these risks playing out? Could applying some of these ideas like clear goals, testing in stages, knowing your starting point, having a backup plan, make those changes go a bit smoother for you?
And it leaves us with that interesting tension we saw, right? The push for speed, like with CI/CD, versus the need for careful control, like the rigid waterfall or the lesson from Lasso Co. How do organizations find that sweet spot? Moving fast enough to compete, but carefully enough to stay stable and manage risk. That balancing act seems like the real ongoing challenge.
Absolutely. A great point to ponder. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into change management. We hope unpacking these sources provided some clarity and useful insights. Keep exploring, keep learning.